In 2017, Portland, Oregon was shaken by a disappearance that seemed impossible. Sarah Lynn Whitmore, a 24-year-old barista and freelance illustrator, vanished on her short walk home. The route was familiar, well lit in parts, crowded during the day but quiet at night. She sent her last text to her boyfriend at 11:08 p.m., writing, "On my way." She never arrived. The case spread fear across the city. Women stopped walking alone at night. Shops along the downtown streets taped missing posters to their windows. Within days, Sarah's name was everywhere. Police moved fast. They set up a command post, blocked off paths near the river, and searched with dogs and volunteers. They found her scarf on the ground, damp and stained with mud. Her backpack lay nearby, the strap frayed as if pulled. Inside were her wallet and ID. Nothing was stolen. This was not a robbery. A neighbor reported hearing a sharp cry near midnight. Another couple told detectives they saw a man in dark clothing walking a few steps behind Sarah. A taxi driver received a call for a pickup at 12:20 a.m., but the rider never appeared. These details created a narrow but chilling timeline. Investigators faced a dead end. The most important camera along her route had stopped recording at the critical moment. There was no body, no suspect, just fragments of evidence and growing frustration. For years, the case remained unsolved. Families asked questions the police could not answer. Was this a random attack? An accident? Or was someone watching Sarah that night? The breakthrough came 6 years later when new forensic methods revealed DNA on Sarah's scarf and bag. A name emerged: Daniel Harper, a maintenance worker who had lived in the same community all along. The man neighbors knew as quiet, odd, but harmless, was suddenly at the center of a murder trial. What began as an ordinary night walk turned into one of Portland's most haunting cases. And the truth, buried for years, finally forced its way into the light. This case is only beginning to unfold. We've seen how a young woman disappeared in the middle of a crowded city, leaving behind silence and unanswered questions. But what kind of person was she? And why did her absence shake an entire community? Stay with us as we step into the next chapter. Sarah Lynn Whitmore was 24 years old when she disappeared in Portland in the fall of 2017. She worked the late shift at a coffee shop in the heart of the city. During the day, she was an illustrator, taking small commissions online, always carrying her sketchbook to capture the streets and faces around her. She lived in a small apartment in the Pearl District with a roommate. The walk from her job to her apartment was only 10 minutes, a distance she had walked countless times before. That night, however, she never made it home. Sarah stood out in the Portland creative scene. Friends described her as the kind of person who connected different groups: artists, baristas, students, even visitors passing through. She was the glue at so many gatherings, one of her colleagues at the café recalled. People noticed her not because she was loud, but because she was always present, sketchbook in hand, drawing something in the corner of a room or near the café window. Her look became familiar around the Pearl District: long brown hair, a navy blue jacket, and the checkered scarf she wore almost every night. She usually carried a small backpack, light enough to hold a sketchbook, a wallet, and some pens. Security footage from the night she vanished showed her wearing those same items, stepping out of the cafe at closing time. The images from that video would later be printed on missing posters and news reports across Portland. Sarah had a stable, ordinary life. Her finances were steady. She had no record, no known enemies, No involvement with drugs or risky behavior. She worked, she drew. She spent evenings with her boyfriend or with friends in the art community. That boyfriend, Mark Lewis, was the last person to hear from her. At 11:08 p.m., she sent him a simple message, "On my way." It was routine, but it became the last trace of her that investigators could rely on. Family ties anchored her daily life. Her mother, Karen, was retired from administrative work and spoke with Sarah almost every day. Karen later said, "If she didn't answer the phone, I worried immediately." That's the kind of relationship we had. Sarah's older brother, Ethan, was in graduate school at the time. He was fiercely protective of his sister, and would later take a visible role in organizing searches and speaking to the press. Sarah's private and professional circles overlapped in Portland's vibrant art scene. She had participated in local exhibitions, small shows at coffee houses, and gatherings of young illustrators. Her disappearance struck at the heart of that community. People who saw her every week couldn't understand how someone so visible could vanish so completely in a well-traveled part of the city. The details of her last known moments came quickly into focus. She finished her café shift, packed her bag, and stepped out into the chilly October night. The streets were damp from light rain. A nearby security camera caught her walking past a storefront, adjusting her scarf and backpack. The timestamp read 23:05. Just minutes later, she sent her final text to Mark. By 23:20, she was gone. A faint witness account surfaced. A couple walking a few paces behind reported seeing a man in a dark hoodie trailing Sarah. They could not make out his face. The dim light, the drizzle, and the short glance left the description vague, but the sighting fixed one thing. Sarah was not alone as she walked those last blocks. That account, fragile as it was, became one of the first leads police took seriously. When Sarah did not return home that night, her roommate assumed she had stayed with Mark. But the absence of evidence made the case more haunting. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, no theft. Her backpack was found near a canal rail along with her checkered scarf. Her phone was recovered but had been switched off minutes after her last text. The ping showed it shutting down near the Burnside bridge, close to where a security camera had mysteriously failed between 11:10 and 11:20 p.m. These fragments painted a picture, but not a clear one. Every detail, the clothing, the backpack, the scarf, was a reminder of how familiar she was to those who knew her. The image of Sarah stepping out of the café became a ghost in the investigation. It was the last moving proof that she had been there, alive, ordinary, heading home. And then, silence. The emotional weight of her disappearance was amplified by the response of her family. Karen became the voice of persistence. She appeared on local television, holding her daughter's photo, urging the public not to let the case fade. Ethan, younger but outspoken, led searches with friends and volunteers. He stapled posters to poles, handed flyers to strangers, and told reporters, "My sister didn't just walk away. Someone did this to her." By the end of 2017, Sarah's name was everywhere in Portland. Flyers hung in cafes, on university boards, at bus stops. Her story was in local headlines week after week. The fact that she was known, loved, and part of the city's daily rhythm made her absence impossible to ignore. Her missing poster wasn't just another notice. It was a shock to anyone who had seen her walk those same streets. The early stage of the case closed with more questions than answers. Who was the man in the hoodie? Why did the camera fail at the critical moment? Why was her scarf left behind if this had been a robbery? And above all, how could a 10-minute walk turn into a mystery that would take years to resolve? As the investigation deepened, Sarah's identity remained central to the story. She was not just a name in a file. She was a daughter, a sister, a partner, a worker. On the night of October 21st, 2017, Sarah Whitmore ended her shift at a downtown Portland café. It was almost 11 o'clock when she stepped out. Surveillance footage captured her clearly, wearing a navy jacket, a checkered scarf, and a small backpack. That clip became the last confirmed image of her alive. At 11:08 p.m., Sarah sent a short text to her boyfriend, Mark Lewis. It read only 2 words: "On my way." The walk home should have taken no more than 10 minutes. Her route was familiar, cutting across a narrow street with little light, and then past the edge of the Burnside canal. A simple walk home that hundreds of people made every night. But Sarah never made it. From 11:05 to 11:20 p.m., she vanished. Investigators would later call this window the missing 15 minutes. Everything about the case would circle back to those few moments. There was one account that night. A couple walking back from dinner reported seeing a young woman who matched Sarah's description. Just a few steps behind her was a man in a dark hoodie. They couldn't see his face. They remembered his frame as thin, the hood drawn low. It wasn't much, but it was the only direct sighting anyone provided. "We thought nothing of it at the time," the couple later told police. "People walk close together in the city all the time. Now we wish we had paid more attention." The weather added to the confusion. A light drizzle had left the streets slick. Reflections from the street lamps blurred on the wet pavement, and sections near the canal were poorly lit. Cameras didn't cover the entire route. The perfect conditions for someone to disappear without being noticed. Worse, one of the cameras closest to the Burnside Bridge failed during the exact time frame Sarah vanished. At 11:10, the feed cut out. At 11:20, it returned. 10 minutes gone, right when Sarah walked through. Police later described it as either a freak technical failure or something more intentional. Either way, it erased the one chance to see what happened. Back at her apartment, there were no bloodstains, no clear signs of a struggle. Nothing to suggest she had fought back, but nothing to prove she had simply fallen either. The absence of evidence became part of the mystery. A neighbor who lived near the canal added one more chilling detail. Around 11:15, they heard a short scream. Just one. "It was quick," the resident recalled. "I wasn't even sure if it was a man or a woman." It stopped as fast as it started. That scream placed a possible confrontation right in the middle of Sarah's missing minutes. By then, the timeline was set. Sarah left work just before 11. She texted Mark at 11:08. Somewhere between the cafe and her apartment, in less than 15 minutes, she disappeared. Everything investigators would later uncover, the belongings, the cell phone data, the witness testimony, pointed back to that narrow window of time. Her friends and co-workers plastered the last image of her, navy jacket, scarf, backpack, onto missing posters across Portland. It became the face of the case, but the crucial details remained unanswered. Who was the man in the hoodie? Why did the camera shut down? and what really happened between 11:05 and 11:20 on a wet October night. This night marked the beginning of one of Portland's most haunting investigations. It was the moment when a young woman walked out of a café and never came home. For her family, it was the beginning of years of waiting, hoping, and pushing for answers. For the city, it was the start of a case that spread fear and suspicion through every neighborhood. The search for Sarah started with that final text, "On my way," and the 15 minutes that followed. Every lead, every rumor, and every piece of evidence would come back to those last steps she took. And it was in those missing minutes that the truth of the case was buried, waiting to be uncovered. As we move forward, the investigation takes its first major turn, with police scrambling to secure the area, collect evidence, and chase down the faint clues that Sarah's disappearance left behind. The morning of October 22, 2017, Portland, nearby businesses had cameras pointing toward the street and the path along the canal. Some of them were never checked until almost a day later. When officers finally asked for the footage, the systems had already written over themselves. Valuable hours of video that could have captured Sarah's last moments, or the man in the dark hoodie, were gone. One shop owner told reporters, "If they had come on that first day, I could have given them everything." But they waited, and my camera reset. The only city camera directly facing the Burnside Bridge had gone dark that very night. It failed between 11:10 and 11:20 p.m., the exact minutes Sarah disappeared. At first it was brushed off as a coincidence. Technical issues happen. But critics pointed out that no one checked the backup data immediately. Days later, when technicians were finally brought in, they confirmed the backup had also failed. What might have been the single most important recording of the case was permanently lost. Even the evidence that did survive was mishandled. The backpack and scarf were picked up and logged, but they were not sealed according to strict procedure. For hours, they sat in the back of a patrol car before being moved into storage. That gap in protocol gave defense attorneys ammunition years later, when the chain of custody became a central issue. At the time, police downplayed the mistake, calling it minor. For Sarah's family, it felt like another sign that urgency was missing. Witnesses were no better treated. The couple who said they saw a man in a hoodie walking a few paces behind Sarah were spoken to briefly. No detailed statement was taken. Their description, slim build, dark sweatshirt, hood up, was not circulated publicly for weeks. Another resident who told police he heard a short, sharp scream near the canal around 11:15 had his account dismissed. In the official log, it was written as uncertain, possibly unrelated. The man later told local news, "They looked at me like I was wasting their time, but I know what I heard." One of the most damaging oversights involved the Uber driver. He had been called to pick up a fare near the Burnside Bridge at 11. Instead of building on those early leads, investigators leaned heavily on one theory: that Sarah had slipped or fallen into the canal. For the first 2 days, dive teams swept the water while patrols scoured the banks. The focus was on an accident, not a crime. This single-track approach consumed the most crucial 48 hours. Meanwhile, evidence on land went cold. Passers-by, volunteers, even media crews walked through the area where Sarah had last been seen. Footprints and impressions were trampled. Small objects that might have mattered were picked up or moved without documentation. The shift to a criminal theory came too late. When the first week ended, Portland police had little to show. The scarf and the backpack were logged, the phone was dead, and every witness lead had been weakened by delay. One headline in the Oregonian read, "Police running out of time and options." Sarah's family grew increasingly vocal. Her mother, Karen, spoke to reporters daily, often outside the police station. "We don't see urgency," she said. "Every hour feels wasted." Her brother Ethan was even sharper. Standing in front of the missing posters he had helped staple across downtown, he told a local news crew, "They're wasting precious time. My sister didn't just vanish. Someone did this, and they're moving too slowly to catch him." Inside the community, anger grew. Volunteers had flooded the streets in the first days, searching alleys and parks, but many felt unsupported. The police gave little guidance. Some volunteers later said they were told to stay out of the way. In frustration, a group of students from Portland State organized their own grid search along the riverbanks. They found nothing, but the effort underscored the gap between what the public was willing to do and what law enforcement was actually doing. The press amplified every misstep. Talk radio hosts questioned why crucial cameras weren't checked faster. Editorials demanded accountability. Even former detectives weighed in. One retired officer said bluntly, "Those first 72 hours are everything. If you lose them, you lose the case." Within the department, morale reportedly dropped. Detectives rotated in and out, but no one could find the missing link. The case grew colder with each passing day. Publicly, police spokespeople insisted they were following all leads. Privately, some officers admitted they had little hope without new evidence. The result was paralysis. By the end of October, the posters of Sarah's face were starting to fade in the rain, but no clear suspect had been named. Every trail seemed broken. The bridge camera was gone. Witness accounts were incomplete. The Uber lead was stale. The items of clothing were contested. All of it pointed back to the first week when the investigation faltered at almost every step. For Sarah's family, the frustration was overwhelming. Karen pressed for meetings with detectives, often leaving them in tears afterward. Ethan launched his own online campaign urging people to keep pressure on the police. Their grief was compounded by a growing sense that those meant to protect had failed at the most critical moment. Looking back, it's clear how the case slipped into years of silence. The early errors set the tone. A limited search area, lost video, mishandled evidence, ignored witnesses, and the wrong focus. Each decision closed a door that might have led to answers. Each delay gave more room for the truth to fade. By the time the first month ended, the community's confidence in Portland police had eroded badly. Protesters held small vigils outside headquarters, holding candles and signs that read, "Do your job." The investigation into Sarah Whitmore's disappearance had stalled. Days passed with no breakthrough, but then the first solid witness accounts began to surface. They didn't solve the mystery, but they shifted the case from confusion to suspicion. A young couple came forward with a chilling detail. On the night of October 21st, as they walked along the canal near Burnside, they noticed Sarah ahead of them. Just a few meters behind her, a man followed. He wore a dark hoodie pulled tightly around his head. His frame was thin, his movements deliberate. They told police, "The distance didn't feel random. He was shadowing her." This account became one of the earliest threads investigators clung to. The description was vague, but it was something. A shadow in the night, too close to ignore. Around the same time, another piece of testimony appeared. A rideshare driver, working the late shift, reported that he had accepted a pickup near Burnside Bridge at 11:30 p.m. He waited at the location, headlights cutting across the dark street. No passenger ever arrived. He told officers, "I saw someone standing a ways off, but they didn't come over. After a few minutes, I canceled." At first, this seemed trivial, but when matched against Sarah's last known movements, the timing was disturbing. Had Sarah intended to call a ride but never made it? Or was the person the driver noticed connected to her disappearance? Then came a neighbor's account. A resident living near the canal told detectives she had heard a scream that same night. Just one sharp cry around 11:15. "It was sudden, and then nothing," she recalled. She couldn't tell if it was male or female. She couldn't pinpoint the exact spot it came from. Police recorded the statement but dismissed it as uncertain. Later, that choice would be criticized. For many, the scream marked the most human moment in the timeline. A fleeting sound that could have been Sarah's last. Physical evidence also began to appear. Officers combing the muddy banks near the wooden footbridge discovered shoe prints pressed into damp soil. The size was consistent with. Attention then turned to Sarah's phone. By the time police retrieved it, the device was dead. The last signal pinged at 11:10 p.m. near Burnside Bridge, just minutes after she texted her boyfriend. Most of her messages were routine, chats with friends, exchanges with her mother, and the last brief line to Mark. "On my way." But buried among them was something different, a string of anonymous texts from days earlier. They were unnerving in their simplicity. "I see you at night. You walk the same path." The account was untraceable, created with a disposable number. Investigators could not link it to any person, yet the tone was unmistakable. Someone had been watching her. These fragments, witnesses, prints, messages, should have given the case momentum, but instead they scattered it. Police had no way to connect them. Each clue floated alone, promising more than it delivered. The couple saw a hooded man, but couldn't describe his face. The driver saw someone waiting, but couldn't confirm who. The scream had no source. The shoe print pointed to a man, but there was no match. The texts were creepy, but anonymous. Together, they looked like the outline of an answer, but none of them locked into place. The press seized on the inconsistencies. Headlines called the case a puzzle with missing pieces. Local stations ran nightly updates, flashing Sarah's image and the words "still missing" in bold letters. Talk shows debated whether Portland was safe anymore. Parents warned their daughters. Women changed routines. The city, known for its vibrant arts and nightlife, now carried a shadow. Family members were less restrained. Ethan, Sarah's brother, confronted reporters on the courthouse steps. "Someone followed her. This wasn't random. You don't just vanish in 10 minutes. His frustration mirrored the growing anger of a community that felt the investigation was stalling. Meanwhile, the police struggled to keep public confidence. They admitted the case was moving slowly, but insisted they were following every lead. Behind closed doors, though, detectives argued about what the evidence meant. Was it a robbery gone wrong? If so, why were Sarah's belongings untouched? Was it an accident? That seemed less likely given the scream and the shoe prints. Or was it someone who knew her? The anonymous messages hinted at a stalker, but no name or face emerged. The uncertainty fed public speculation. Online forums lit up with theories. Some claimed Sarah had planned to disappear. Others insisted the city was dealing with a serial predator. Rumors swirled faster than facts, and each rumor chipped away at trust in the authorities. Even within the case file, cracks were visible. The Uber driver's testimony wasn't officially documented until a week later. The resident's scream was downgraded to not credible. The shoe print was logged, but not prioritized. Each oversight weakened the chain of evidence. Critics would later say these failures delayed justice by years. Despite the frustration, one thing was clear. Sarah's disappearance was no accident. The pieces, though scattered, pointed toward human involvement. A hooded man following her, a scream breaking the night, a shoe print not her own, messages from an unknown watcher. These details turned the case from a missing person report into a criminal investigation. The effect on the community was immediate. Posters covered utility poles and shop windows. Missing Sarah Whitmore. Volunteers organized nightly searches, flashlights sweeping through alleys and parks. Women began walking in groups or taking ride shares even for short trips. Stores near the canal installed brighter lights and security cameras. A sense of unease hung over Portland. Everyone wondered who the hooded figure was and whether he was still out there. The family's grief sharpened into determination. Sarah's mother, Karen, addressed the press in trembling words. "Somebody knows what happened. Please, if you saw anything, say something." The plea was echoed by neighbors, by friends, by strangers who felt tied to the case. The investigation began with one of the most obvious theories: a random robbery gone wrong. Sarah had been walking home late at night through a dimly lit street near the Burnside Bridge. It was easy to imagine an attacker taking advantage of the opportunity. But when detectives reviewed what she had carried that night, the theory started to crumble. Her bag was found near the water. Inside were her wallet, her ID, her money. Nothing had been taken. If this was a robbery, why leave everything behind? One officer admitted later. The absence of theft cast doubt on the entire idea. Attention quickly shifted to another, darker possibility. On Sarah's phone, investigators uncovered a string of messages from an anonymous account. They weren't friendly. They weren't casual. They sounded like someone who had been watching her. The words were short and unsettling. "I see you at night. You walk the same path." The tone was clear. Whoever had written them wanted Sarah to know she was being observed. That discovery immediately changed the way detectives looked at the case. It wasn't only the text messages. A couple walking near the river that same night recalled seeing Sarah ahead of them. Just a few steps behind her, they noticed a man in a dark hoodie. They remembered his thin build, his hood pulled low over his face. The way he followed her, it didn't feel like chance, the witness told police. The detail matched the anonymous messages and pointed to something more than a robbery. It suggested obsession, surveillance, maybe even stalking. Still, not everyone agreed. Some investigators argued for a simpler explanation: an accident. The night was damp, the streets slick with rain. Sarah had taken a path that bordered the river. If she slipped, if she lost her balance, she could have fallen into the water. That would explain why she never came home. At first glance, it sounded possible, but the more they looked, the less sense it made. Near the wooden walkway close to the bridge, detectives found a footprint pressed into the wet soil. It was a man's shoe, not Sarah's. Police began compiling a list of possible suspects. They looked at night shift workers in the area, maintenance crews who worked along the Burnside bridge, residents with troubling histories who lived near the waterfront, online accounts that had sent threatening or anonymous messages. One by one they were interviewed. Some were questioned more than once. But no single person fit everything. The footprint didn't match. The phone records didn't match. And the physical descriptions from witnesses were too vague to confirm. The man in the hoodie remained a shadow. As the weeks dragged on, the pieces refused to lock together. They had a threatening set of texts. They had a sighting of a man trailing Sarah. They had an unexplained scream and a footprint on damp soil. But none of it created a full picture. There was no blood, no body, no eyewitness to the actual crime. Each theory broke apart under closer scrutiny. A robbery with no theft. A stalker without proof of contact. An accident, with evidence pointing to someone else's presence. Reporters seized on the confusion. Headlines appeared in local papers. Sarah Whitmore, victim of accident or stalker's target. Talk shows debated the case. Commentators argued about whether Portland police had mishandled the crucial early hours. Neighbors divided into camps. Some clung to the idea that Sarah had fallen into the water by mistake. Others were convinced she had been followed, cornered, and taken. Sarah's family refused to accept the accident theory. Her brother Ethan spoke openly to the press. Sarah didn't just vanish because she tripped, he said firmly. Someone was out there that night. Someone followed her. We need to find out who. His anger resonated with the community, fueling skepticism toward official explanations. The case grew into a local obsession. Television news stations aired nightly updates. Radio shows fielded calls from worried residents. Social media lit up with speculation, amateur sleuths, and endless theories. The effect was twofold. The public was engaged, but the police felt pressured to deliver answers they didn't have. The contradictions inside the case. Theories had been tested, suspects interviewed, but Sarah's disappearance remained a mystery. All the community had were fragments that pointed in every direction and in none at all. But technology doesn't stand still. Forensic science was moving forward even as the case went dormant. Years later, what once looked like scattered, meaningless traces would take on new power under a microscope. Breakthroughs in DNA testing, methods unavailable in 2017, would reopen the box everyone thought was sealed shut. And when those results came back, they didn't just create new questions. They changed everything. What do you think about these conflicting theories? Robbery, accident, or stalking? None of them fully explained Sarah's disappearance, and the case seemed stuck. But years later, science would expose the truth hiding in those scraps of evidence. Stay with us as we uncover how a new DNA test finally broke the silence. In 2023, 6 years after Sarah Whitmore vanished on her short walk home, the Portland Police Department placed her file into the cold case program. Investigators had reached a point where conventional leads were exhausted. But science had changed. Technology that did not exist in 2017 was now available, offering a second chance. The first step was simple but critical. The scarf Sarah wore, her backpack, and even small fragments of fabric recovered near the railing were carefully re-examined. This time, technicians used next-generation trace DNA analysis. Unlike older methods, it could identify genetic material from just a handful of cells. In cases like Sarah's, where almost every visible clue had disappeared, this technology offered a lifeline. The results shifted the case in an instant. Alongside Sarah's own DNA, the lab reported a second profile: male, unknown, and consistent across multiple items. The DNA was strong enough to be entered into CODIS, the national database. Within days, the computer returned a name: Daniel Harper. At the time of the test, Harper was 34 years old, a maintenance worker employed by the city, living on the east side. On paper, Harper seemed ordinary. He had worked for the city for years, repairing streetlights, and still, the team resisted rushing to arrest. They wanted a case that would stand in court, not collapse under scrutiny. Surveillance began quietly. Officers followed Harper as he moved between his apartment, his job, and late-night walks that seemed to have no purpose. He rarely spoke to others. He carried a small toolkit, a habit from his work, and often walked close to the Burnside Bridge area. Detectives then pulled data from Harper's phone records. When mapped against Sarah's final days, overlaps appeared. Harper's phone had connected to towers near Burnside Bridge on several evenings before October 21, 2017. He had been in the same zone at the same time, night after night. It suggested a pattern, not coincidence. Another clue linked Harper to Sarah even more directly. The anonymous messages Sarah received, taunting notes like, "I see you at night," were traced back to a public Wi-Fi hotspot. Logs showed that Harper had used that same access point on multiple occasions. The chain was not perfect, but the alignment between the messages, his presence near the bridge, and the DNA was too strong to ignore. By the summer of 2023, rumors spread. The cold case unit was working overtime. Journalists sensed movement. Local headlines read, "Hope renewed in Whitmore case," and "DNA may finally speak for Sarah." For the family, the news brought painful anticipation. Sarah's brother Ethan told reporters, "We've waited 6 years. If there's new technology, then it must be used to its fullest. We need the truth." Inside the department, pressure built. The evidence stack was becoming impossible to deny. The DNA was clear. The phone data added weight. The Wi-Fi connection tied Harper to the disturbing messages. But prosecutors wanted certainty. Labs repeated their work one final time. The outcome never changed. Daniel Harper's DNA was present on Sarah's belongings. With 3 independent confirmations, detectives carried their file to the Multnomah County Court. The request was direct: a warrant to arrest Harper for the disappearance and presumed homicide of... The breakthrough was not just about one man. It reflected a larger change in criminal investigations. Technology had moved forward, and with it, the possibility of justice even in the dullest files. Officers admitted privately that, without the new methods, Harper might never have been identified. One detective told a journalist off record, "This is proof that no case is beyond science. The smallest trace can rewrite the story." For the Whitmore family, the development was bittersweet. Karen, Sarah's mother, said she could not celebrate until the court delivered its verdict. Ethan was less cautious. He told local television, "Someone followed my sister. We all knew it. Now we finally have a name." The following weeks saw a quiet build-up. Surveillance remained in place, and every movement of Harper was logged. Officers waited for the right moment. The community had no idea that the man they passed on the sidewalk, the man fixing a streetlight or walking home in the rain, was about to be accused of one of the city's most haunting crimes. As the file moved from police to prosecutors, the picture became clearer. DNA linked Harper to Sarah's belongings. Witnesses placed a man in a hoodie behind her. Phone data put him at the bridge night after night. The anonymous messages traced back to the networks he used. Each piece alone raised suspicion. Together they formed a web. The stage was set. With the warrant in hand, the cold case unit prepared for the final step. They would move on Harper's home in the early hours, when resistance was least likely and the chance of escape was gone. No one in Portland knew that the answer to Sarah's disappearance lived among them for 6 years. Neighbors greeted Harper with casual nods. Co-workers shared shifts with him. All the while, evidence sat quietly on a scarf and backpack, waiting for technology to reveal its voice. In September 2023, Portland police finally moved in. After 6 long years, they had enough evidence to act. The cold case unit, backed by forensic specialists and detectives who had followed every lead, entered a small rundown apartment in Eastside. It was the home of Daniel Harper, the man who had lived among them for years. Harper didn't resist. Officers described him as calm, almost detached, as they placed him in handcuffs. One neighbor later told reporters, "We used to greet him every morning. We never imagined he was the suspect." For a city that had carried the weight of unanswered questions since 2017, the arrest landed like a thunderclap. The story dominated headlines within hours. Local papers splashed the words "Burnside shock" across their front pages. Television crews rushed to the scene. On social media, Portland residents expressed disbelief. People realized that the man accused of stalking and killing Sarah Whitmore had been living quietly in their community. "If he could be right here," one resident asked in a televised interview, "how many others like him are still out there?" The trial began months later, and the courtroom filled with reporters, lawyers, and members of the Whitmore family. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They began with the cornerstone of the investigation: DNA. Forensic experts explained that tiny traces of male DNA had been recovered from Sarah's scarf and backpack. Using advanced techniques, they were able to build a profile, and it matched Daniel Harper. Not just once, but across multiple independent tests. The match was absolute. The jury also heard testimony about Harper's movements in the days before Sarah's disappearance. Cell phone records placed him near Burnside Bridge at almost the exact hours Sarah would walk home. Wi-Fi logs connected to a public hotspot showed that Harper had accessed the network multiple nights from the same location. When investigators traced the anonymous messages Sarah had received, "I see you at night," and "you walk the same path," the trail led back to that hotspot. Harper was there. Witnesses stepped forward to recount what they had seen. The couple who had walked near the canal the night Sarah vanished repeated their story in court. They described a tall, thin man in a dark hoodie following just steps behind her. "The distance wasn't casual," one of them testified. "It looked deliberate." Their words echoed through the room, sharpening the picture the prosecution was painting. Harper and his lawyers pushed back. He denied every allegation. "I'm being set up," he told the court, insisting he had no connection to Sarah and no reason to harm her. His attorney challenged the state's evidence, focusing heavily on the handling of physical samples. These items sat in storage for 6 years, the lawyer argued. Could cross-contamination explain the DNA? Forensic experts rejected the claim outright. They explained that the evidence was preserved under strict protocols and that multiple labs working independently reached the same result. One analyst stated, "This is the clearest match we've had in this case." There is no error. The prosecution pressed their advantage. They reminded the jury that Sarah's possessions were found near the canal, not in her home. That in closing statements, the prosecution spoke directly to the jury. Science doesn't lie. Sarah Whitmore's scarf and backpack carried his DNA. The phone records place him at the scene. The witnesses describe a man who matches him. There is no other explanation. He was there. He followed her. He ended her life. The defense countered with doubt, urging the jury not to convict on circumstantial evidence. "There is no body," the attorney said. "There is no video of an attack. You are being asked to convict on pieces of evidence that leave gaps." The jury deliberated for hours. They asked to review the DNA reports again and to hear once more from the witnesses who had seen Harper near Sarah. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of murder. The judge pronounced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Harper showed little emotion as the decision was read. His eyes stayed down, his hands folded on the table. The reaction in the courtroom was overwhelming. Sarah's mother, Karen, wept openly. Her brother, Ethan, clenched his fists and let out a breath that had been trapped inside for 6 years. Outside, supporters hugged and lit candles in her memory. The city of Portland finally had an answer. Karen addressed reporters briefly. "We have our answer," she said softly, holding a photo of her daughter. Ethan's statement was sharper. "Sarah didn't just disappear. Someone did this to her. Now we know who, and now he will never hurt anyone again." The case became a touchstone in Oregon. Newspapers called it proof of what persistence and science could achieve. Commentators spoke about how DNA technology had changed the course of justice, turning a case once thought unsolvable into a closed chapter. But for the Whitmore family, closure didn't mean relief. The loss remained even as the trial ended. "There is no victory here," Ethan told a reporter. "There is only truth. And at least now we have that." Harper's conviction didn't end the conversation. Instead, it opened new ones about safety in Portland, about the importance of evidence preservation, and about how many other cold cases might still be waiting for breakthroughs. 6 years after the night Sarah Whitmore, Portland marked the moment in a way the city would remember. A public memorial rose beside the Burnside Canal, a few steps from the path Sarah walked each night. Hundreds came, friends from the café, local artists with paint still under their nails, students who knew the posters by heart, neighbors who had searched along the waterline with flashlights. They carried candles and flowers. Photos ringed a low platform, and at the center lay a checkered scarf, the same pattern seen in the last camera image, now a symbol of the work that uncovered the truth. No speeches tried to rewrite what happened. People stood, listened to the water, and faced the place where the timeline broke. The city then placed a bronze plaque near Burnside Bridge. The inscription was plain and final. In memory of Sarah Lynn Whitmore, 1993 to 2017. Never forgotten. Under it, a QR code linked to a city page with nighttime safety tips, hotlines, and an updated list of unsolved cases. Visitors scanned the code and lingered. Police patrols adjusted their routes. A shop owner across the street added a camera and left the floodlights on. "We still cross that bridge," a passerby said softly. "But now we look up." The Whitmore family started a scholarship in Sarah's name. The Sarah Whitmore Scholarship Fund focused on art students who tie their projects to community life: public murals, safety design, neighborhood storytelling, urban wayfinding. The first recipients pledged to paint a series along the canal. Simple maps, well-lit direction markers, and small portraits of people who walk home late. The scholarship did not change what happened, but it made sure Sarah's name moved forward with purpose. Her habit of carrying a sketchbook became a blueprint for helping others. Law enforcement also moved. The case entered academy classrooms as a lesson written in plain terms. Document early, secure everything, and assume today's unknowns may be solved by tomorrow's tools. Property rooms upgraded cold storage. Reporters covered the reforms like they covered the arrest, step by step, with scrutiny. One headline captured the broader takeaway: the case that reshaped Portland's trust in forensic science. The public conversation changed. People understood that the scarf and the backpack were not just objects. They were carriers of signals that could be read years later, if preserved the right way. Rumors faded against lab reports and controlled retests. Conspiracy theories lost air when the second and third confirmations came back identical. The message was not that police are perfect now. It was that a system can correct when it accepts its early mistakes and rebuilds its process. Community groups took the momentum and pushed it beyond this single case. Neighborhood associations scheduled night walk audits and marked dark spots where bulbs were out or trees hid the light. Cafés updated closing routines so workers left in pairs or under a visible camera. Universities invited forensic specialists to explain how touch DNA works and how contamination is prevented, because clarity creates trust. A barista who once worked with Sarah summed it up in a single line: "We're not helpless if we keep receipts. Evidence is a receipt." It was blunt. It was right. Families from other cold cases reached out to the task force. Some asked for retesting. Others wanted chain of custody reviews. The city's website, newly linked from the plaque, tracked requests and outcomes in public view. That transparency kept pressure on the system. It also protected it. When results took months, updates explained why: backlogs, reagent supply, or follow-up comparisons across databases. The important part was that silence no longer filled the gap. For Portland, the case left a durable script for what to do after the headlines. Honor the person, fix the process, educate the public, and keep working the other files. For the Whitmores, it meant a quieter home, a scholarship to manage, and a calendar marked by the date of the verdict. There was no talk of closure in easy terms. There was accountability, documented by a verdict, strengthened by protocol, and witnessed by a city that showed up. The final lesson reads as simply as the plaque: justice may arrive late, but it does not disappear. Sound procedure beats speculation. Re-examination beats resignation. When families push, communities watch, and labs innovate, stalemates break. Names once stuck in unsolved lists move into case summaries with outcomes. The space between those columns is where persistence lives. The scarf at the memorial is not proof by itself. It is memory. The proof sat in lab reports, expert testimony, and the careful custody that allowed DNA to speak in full sentences. The outcome did not rest on one dramatic moment. It rested on a sequence: collection, preservation, reanalysis, database match, surveillance cross-checks, and a trial where every link survived challenge. That is why the verdict withstood the day. It is also why the case now teaches others how to build stronger files from minute one. Before people left the canal that evening, someone read the inscription out loud. Another person whispered, "We